Good morning to everybody. It's good to be with you again. So this is the second on a series which I've called The Temple Throughout the Bible, and that's a bit boring in some ways. So I'm thinking in my own mind now, it's about encountering God through the various temples that we find in the Bible. And this story goes all the way from Genesis to Revelation. And what has particularly intrigued me, which is why I've engaged in this study, is the way that eventually Paul says that we are the temple. We are the temple of the Holy Spirit. So why did he choose that particular illustration and analogy? And I think the best way to understand that is to get a more thorough grasp of what a temple was like all the way through. And we're heading towards that eventually. So last time I introduced the idea of the many, many different kinds of temples throughout the Bible, and hopefully showed you how the Garden of Eden was the first example of what would be known as a temple, although words like sacred space or garden sanctuary would perhaps be a better description at that point. But God himself planted that garden within Eden, and he settled Adam within it. And in fact, Jewish thinking outside of the scriptures is very clear that this was to be regarded as a very holy place, almost like the Holy of Holies was to become. And then, in fact, worship took place there between Adam and Eve and God, towards God, and communion with God, and so on. So I think I'm very clear that the Garden of Eden is the first of the meeting places between God and man and mankind. So what does this actually say then about Adam himself if we're now to rethink our idea of the Garden of Eden in terms of a temple? Well, we've usually thought of Adam as a gardener. That was his job. It may not have needed much work in the first place, as God had made it perfect. But what about a little bit later on? What's his job to do the weeding and maybe a bit of pruning here and there? Or what about all those animals that were roaming around? There's quite a bit to keep him occupied. But once we stop thinking of the Garden of Eden like our garden or like a wildlife safari park, then gardener or park keeper isn't quite the best description for Adam. So what about him being called then a priest? If the Garden of Eden is a temple, is Adam a priest? Well, the key verse is in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 15, where we read that Adam was placed in the garden to work it and take care of it. That's pretty vague in some ways, but those two verbs are very instructive once you dig into the Hebrew of them. And together, to work and take care does indicate a priestly role. So you might find it translated in lots of different ways. The word work, based upon avodah or avad, means any kind of work or service, and therefore it can be garden-based, if you like. There could be an agricultural task involved. The phrase to work the ground would be an example of how that is translated. But also the same word for work, avad, can convey the idea of divine service within a dedicated sacred space, similar to that carried out by the Levitical priesthood in the tabernacle. And in particular, that's the way this word for work is used when it's paired with the second verb in Genesis 2:15, the idea of take care of, which is sometimes translated as to guard or to keep, as in keep a careful watch over something. And that verb, based upon shamar, basically means to be on guard in order to watch over something, to carry out your duties because you have a responsibility. So the two verbs in Genesis 2:15, to work or tend and take care of, are often used to describe priestly activity. I'm just going to read you one example. It's in Numbers chapter 3, and I will highlight it as I go through it. But this is what it says concerning the tribe of Levi. They are to perform duties, that's the shamar verb, for him and for the whole community, by doing the work, avodat, of the tabernacle. They are to take care, that's the shamar verb, of all the furnishings of the tent of meeting by doing the work, again, avodah, of the tabernacle. So the regular pairing of these two verbs that we find in Genesis 2:15, I think, is part of what was going to become the priestly language of the time, and therefore reflects something of Adam's role within the garden, maybe even his primary role. His first duty was more as a priest. So I now think of Adam more as a guardian than a gardener, although I'm not saying he didn't have to do a bit of gardening at the times. We don't know. But time and again, throughout the Old Testament, we find these two verbs together explaining the priestly duties. And so I would say that this was part of what Adam was asked to do. There may have been physical labour involved, but there was certainly a spiritual obligation. He was to serve in the sanctuary of the garden, take care of it, look after it in every respect, and ensuring that it remained dedicated to God and fit for his purposes. On that basis, I think we can say he was God's first priest, or the first example of what was to become a priesthood. And part of his responsibility goes back to Genesis 1, where there is a commission, effectively, about God having created mankind, and he blessed them, and he said, now be fruitful and increase, and fill the earth, subdue it, basically spread me and the knowledge of God everywhere within the whole earth. It was to come out of the Garden of Eden would be this knowledge of God, and it was part of Adam's role was to be fruitful, multiply, and send his offspring out into the world to spread the knowledge of God, which I think is also a priestly function, and I would suggest is part of our priestly function, that what we are meant to do is to spread the knowledge of God. And how do you get that knowledge of God? Because you're in communion with him within his temple, in this case, as we say today, within our own temple. But for Adam's point, it was from the garden he was to commune with God so that he could then pass on the knowledge of God to everybody. And it's similar to our mission today. We might want to discuss that later in our Q&A. How do we fulfill what was actually Adam's mission? But because, of course, Adam failed as a priest. And the reason he failed was that because he listened to another voice. He wasn't prepared just to listen to God. He listened to the voice of the tempter. He listened to the desires of his own heart. And he wanted to have knowledge of God without reference to God, to do things his own way, to make decisions independent of his maker. He wanted to be like God, not just be a servant of God. And that's a lesson as well, isn't it? Because the consequences of that were devastating, not just for Adam and Eve, but for the whole world since then. So if Adam was the first priest, yes, he failed as that priest. And God's response in Genesis 3, particularly verse 9, I think is very poignant and very sensitive. Where God comes along expecting to meet with him as usual, and he says, where are you? Where are you? That's Genesis 3, verse 9. I think that's the best indication of Adam's failure, is that when God turns up to meet with him again, he has to ask, where are you? In some versions, although it's not in the original, his name is put in front of that. Adam, where are you? Which makes it, I think, even more poignant and more personal, if you like, emphasizing the relationship which is now no longer there. In fact, in Hebrew, that phrase, where are you, is actually just one particular word. It's not three words, it's one, a yakar. And I don't see it as just a sort of request for some information about Adam's location. This is not about geography. You know, where are you? God knows exactly where he's hiding and so on. I think behind that question is the deeper sense of, why aren't you here? Why aren't you with me as usual? Where have you gone? And again, God knew the answer to this, but he wanted Adam to voice it for himself. So that question, where are you, I think was a spiritual one as well as a geographical one. It's a good question to ask ourselves, isn't it? Where are we with God? Are we in communion with him and so on? And I think God's question there is as much a lament on the part of God. Why aren't you with me anymore? Where have you gone? And there's real regret and sorrow in that. It's actually the same Hebrew word that opens the book of Lamentations, which is Jeremiah lamenting over the fall of Jerusalem, where it's usually translated as, how? How has this happened? But of course, it had happened. That relationship, that communion was broken. And so Adam and Eve had to leave the garden. They couldn't stay there because they were no longer in a fit place, a fit state of being to be able to do that. He had failed to guard the temple. He defiled the sanctuary, so he was banished. And we notice that at the end of that in Genesis, that God sets up a new guard, namely the cherubim, to guard the way to the tree of life. He stationed cherubim there. And it's the same word, to guard, based upon Shema. So before we leave that and move on to the altars bit, just have a little summary here of what I mean by the Garden of Eden. That when God created that particular space, it was to be the most holy of all places that he had created. So we've already got the essence of the idea of there's going to be several levels as you go through the tabernacle and the temple and so on, from the outer courts to the inner courts and then to the most holy of places. And the Garden of Eden, I think, would be the equivalent of that innermost sanctuary. It was in the Garden of Eden that God would come and walk, the same idea of God's presence in the tabernacle. God came to walk amongst his people, and it was to be looked after in the same way with priestly duties. And there are other aspects of the Garden of Eden which come through, which we're going to find in other temples. It says about the Garden of Eden was on the east side, and the east was always the most significant direction from which you came to the tabernacle or the temple, and it was also significant in Ezekiel's vision and so on. So another little hint there of something to come. And of course, the cherubim, the real cherubim, we don't know how long they guarded the Garden of Eden, but we know eventually that, if you like, replicas of them, the golden version of the cherubim, were going to be put inside the tabernacle and the temple to guard the most holy place, particularly the Ark of the Covenant, when that's there. The tree of life has disappeared, come back again in the book of Revelation, but instead we seem to have got a seven-branched candlestick, or the menorah, which was sometimes called the tree of life in Jewish terms, but it had that aspect of representing a tree. And also the other aspects of Eden, which we won't spend any time on, is that it was full of all the sort of minerals, especially gold, that one day would become prevalent within the temple buildings that was wanted as well. So there we are. That's the Garden of Eden. That was Adam's role within it until he was banished because of his failure to stay in communion with God and therefore to be able to serve him as priests should. So what happened next then? What are the next things that we learn in the book of Genesis? Well, people still called on the name of the Lord. That's a key phrase there. But calling on the name of the Lord gives the impression of distance, that God is now more remote, harder to get in touch with. It's not like the same communion that they had within the garden. Yes, you can still call on God, but there's something of a distance involved there. And one of the ways they tried to reach out to God was to build altars, which is why that's the next step. Although altars are not temples, but altars are going to be very prevalent within temples, I think it's worth just spending a few minutes looking at the idea of an altar because of its importance at that particular moment before you get any other buildings, but also because they become important within those buildings. Well, the first person in the Bible we read about who built an altar was Noah. When he came out of the ark, no doubt in gratitude for being preserved, he sacrificed burnt offerings on the altar. Now, the Hebrew for altar is mizbeach, and that comes from a word meaning to slaughter with a view to making a sacrifice. So that's why it's called an altar. There has to be a sacrifice involved for a place to be an altar. And Noah was the first to do that. So was he God's new priest? Was he Adam's replacement? Well, no, for various reasons, and partly because of his own, I think, sinfulness and misbehavior. He was righteous enough to be preserved, but he wasn't the best person to be the successor as God's priests. So the next people we come across that build altars are the patriarchs. So the story's moved on through the Bible, and we've now reached Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And there's a considerable significance of altars within their lives, which is why I asked for Jacob's experience at Bethel to be read out. So they're very significant as well in our story of biblical temples. Several altars were established by Abraham once he'd reached the land of Canaan. A lot more were set up later by Isaac, or a few more, as I should say, and also by Jacob. And they're scattered throughout Genesis. So I'm just going to skip very quickly to get to the one with Jacob, because I think that's the key one. But if you want a little exercise for yourself at some point, start reading from Genesis chapter 12 and find all those occasions when Abraham and then Isaac and then Jacob built an altar, and look at why they built the altar. What was the context for it? And I think there's very significant details from there. Now, one aspect of these altars that they built was, of course, they were all outdoors at this point. There's no physical building. They're not inside something. They are still, if you like, call it garden-based, if you like. Sometimes there were trees in the vicinity. Sometimes there were other stones and that nearby that they would use. Quite possibly, a lot of them were already Canaanite sacred sites. So when Abraham or Isaac or Jacob made their own altar in that place, you can sense that they were redeeming it for the Lord, or at least claiming it for him, because these places have been associated with other deities. So Abraham built an altar at Shechem and later on at Hebron, and perhaps most significantly at a mountain in the region of Moriah. And that was after the idea of he was told to sacrifice Isaac, which of course we know of as the binding of Isaac, is the way the Jewish story is told, the Akedah. And he did this in the place which later on would become the site for Solomon's temple. Interesting how that links in with the future temple to come. So, but the other thing that is very important about these temples for the patriarchs is they didn't settle in that place. They had a nomadic lifestyle. They were travelers, effectively, particularly with their livestock. And everywhere they went, they pitched their tent. And when they pitched their tent, sometimes they built an altar to go with it as part of their worship, calling on the name of the Lord, and so on. And Abraham did that quite regularly. Isaac built an altar at Beersheba, a place that Jacob also visited later. But the significant thing also is that these are places where God appeared to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, places where they encountered God and God spoke to them, and something significant happened as a result. If you like, it changed things, it moved the story on. It helped Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to understand God and his purposes for them, and so on. So building an altar was a key part in their journeying life with God at that particular point. So I want to focus in on the Jacob story at Bethel, which we had read, and it's in two parts, as I'm sure you know anyway. But from that, the Genesis 28 passage involves his dream, a very important dream that he had at Bethel. He stopped off there on his way to Haran. He probably chose it deliberately, as it was already known as a place that Abraham had stayed and worshipped God and had built an altar there. So he arrives based upon the fact that it was the typical place to stop there, and it just says he came to a certain place. But the Hebrew there, the word machom, which can just mean a place or a location, but is often meant for something that's got a sense of purpose or of history, perhaps even a sacred place, and so on. And in the reading, we heard that Jacob eventually said, "How awesome is this place?" or even, "How fearful this place has become." And that was his reaction to this dream, this encounter with God in which he saw heaven opened, the ladder between heaven and earth. Are we getting some contact back again now? Is heaven and earth coming back together again after the banishment from Eden? with angels going backwards and forwards on it and so on. Um, Certainly Jacob had a close personal encounter with the Lord through this dream and had a strong message given to him full of promise. And so Jacob changed the name of the place from Luz to Bethel. And I'm sure you know that Bethel or Bethel means the house of God. Bet-El, the house of God. And already we're seeing something where the word house would be a later way of describing a physical temple, physical building for God, particularly at Jerusalem. So perhaps something new is emerging here. There's going to be a house, a dwelling place. But at this point, it was just a meeting place between Jacob and God. And Jacob took the stone he'd been sleeping on and changed it from a pillow to a pillar and poured oil on it. And that's the same idea as building an altar. Very simple, very basic in those days. Just put a stone or some stones in place, pour oil on it, and worship God there. And in fact, he made a vow that in response to the promises that God had made to him, a vow that he would return. And that's why we read the second portion from Genesis in chapter 35, where he's told to go and also to build an altar there, even more so. And that's where he is renamed from Jacob to Israel. And that's one of the most significant parts or episodes in the whole of this Genesis story, really, where Jacob meets God again there, and his holy presence is part of his calling for what he's going to do. So, significant places in which altars were built in order to establish, if you like, that encounter, that communion, that moment with God, which was going to change people's lives and eventually move us on towards the other temples that we know of, and eventually to ourselves and to God's whole plan for dwelling again with men. So again, there are certain features of these altars which are in common. And as I say, one of the things is that it's not surprising that they built altars wherever they went. They pitched their tent, and because they weren't going to stay there, they were nomadic. And then the first thing they did would be to build an altar. And therefore, these altars became sort of landmarks, if you like, once they'd moved on. They stayed there because the intention was not that they would be the permanent dwelling place of God. They were landmarks that meant something as they moved on. And there's an interesting passage in some of the other Jewish books outside the scriptures, which we know is not inspired or authoritative, but still gives us some extra information. You might have heard of the book of Jubilees, part of the, not even in the Apocrypha, actually, it's in the next group of books further down the chain, if you like. But in the book of Jubilees, which is actually a sort of another commentary on the book of Genesis, very similar material in there. And there we read about this altar at Bethel that Jacob intended to add to it and make it more permanent. It says he resolved to surround it with a wall and sanctify it and make it holy forever. That's what he thought he would do. But in a vision at night, an angel told him not to do that, not to engage in further building. Don't turn it into an eternal sanctuary. It wasn't yet the time or the place for something of that kind. It was just an altar on the way. And incidentally, if you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the most important scrolls in there is called the Temple Scroll. And in there, there's a portion which God says that on a day of creation, I will create my sanctuary, establishing it for myself for all time, according to the covenant which I have made with Jacob at Bethel. And I think that says two things. One is it indicates the importance of Bethel and the covenant that God made with him, what happened there with Jacob, but also that God eventually is looking further ahead. He's got more in mind, that only he can establish an eternal temple, and it will happen in a future day of creation, whatever that might mean. I think it might be even looking forward to the end of the book of Revelation. It's part of the new heaven and the new earth. But basically it was, don't try and settle something there as though that's the permanent final temple, keep moving on and keep establishing more temples for me, because that's what God was wanting to do. I will create my sanctuary. This is going to be a key point of all of these, that the true temples are the ones that God himself builds, or at least he built the Garden of Eden. He told at the place and the time when the altars were to be built, he's going to give instructions for the tabernacle and for the temple, and eventually for us, the ecclesia, the new temple of God. Who can build that? Only Jesus, not men. To follow his instructions in the same way as we'll see another time. Moses had to do that with the tabernacle, and that Solomon had to do with the temple. So already here, there's something that's setting something up for the rest of the story. And these altars were memorials to significant moments rather than permanent established settings. And in fact, 3 times with Jacob's encounter with God at Bethel, we read it was the place where God had talked with him. God is beginning to talk again with particular people, get a closer experience, perhaps similar to what Adam knew. And perhaps this is an indication that one day such a relationship might be restored. And so today, as the followers of Jesus and as the temple of God, we can draw lessons from all of this. God wants to talk to us. God wants to recommission us. The commission of Adam to go into all the world and fulfill it and subdue it and pass on the knowledge of God, I think is the same as Jesus' commission at the end of Matthew to go and make disciples. It's the same idea. Spread the knowledge of God and the salvation he offers. Draw other people into this new living temple that we're now part of. And as we plant new communities of believers, sometimes small or online, doesn't matter how it is, then that's the next stage of what God is doing. We build these altars of self-sacrifice as a witness to the God that we serve. Each one might seem small, a bit insignificant, but if we all do our bit, if we're all part of this priesthood, we're all living stones within the temple, then the overall impact is considerable. And so the story of the temple after Eden has taken this particular twist and turn, and we're now setting up on a path towards one which is going to involve tents and tabernacles and buildings and humans, and eventually in Revelation filling the whole cosmos. So the patriarchs weren't the sinless priests that Adam was meant to be, but I think a start has been made here towards the recovery of God's original temple. There's now going to be a bit of a pause, because as you know, at the end of Genesis, what happened? Jacob and all his family went down to Egypt for several generations. But we also read at the end of Genesis that God will be with them and ensure that his descendants will return. So our next part of the story, for next month, we're going to move on then to Moses. Moses is the next one in the story of the temple, and in particular, of course, the tabernacle. So that's to come in a month's time.